In keeping with the theme of our past couple of shows, we're going to continue with the songwriter secret, but we're going to take it to some different places so we can land where it is that I want us to land at the end of the day. After looking at these things and coming to the conclusions that we've come to already from listening to the songs, now it's time to get a little bit more background, tangible information from researchers who don't have a spiritual dog in the fight, at least, or at least a religious dog. So what I wanted to do tonight was I wanted to introduce those who are new to David Mcgowan's work, to David Mcgowan. For those who've been here for some time, we first looked at this book, I think, in 2015 or 16, collectively. It may have even been 2017, but I know that when I began to read the book and look up Mr. Gowan and his information, shortly after I had just recently got turned on to him and turned other people on to him by way of this channel, he passed. And he was making the circuit at the time. He began to make the rounds in the truth community. And again, as we know, there is a secular truther community. It's alive and well. But Mr. Mcgowan did strike me from his writings as being a man who cared about right and wrong, and a man who wanted to reveal the deceptions that he had found himself to be quite shocking. Things that he discovered as a researcher concerning Laurel Canyon and the hippie movement that sprung forth from it, from the Haight-Ashbury district and the hippie movement in general, Woodstock and all of those things. He's covered those nicely, but he really dives deep into the Laurel Canyon aspect of it all. Laurel Canyon is where the LaBianca Tate murders occurred. The LaBiancas, and of course, probably most listeners here are familiar with Sharon Tate, who was the wife of Roman Polanski, the director of Rosemary's Baby, ironically, which was about the giving of a baby to devil worshippers. And a lot of people made the correlation because, of course, Manson and the family have been called a lot of things, or Manson and his quote-unquote followers were called a lot of things, and among those things were devil worshippers. He said to them that he wanted them to write something witchy on the walls. But it's important to also come back to this, because as we look into the worldwide conspiracy, that's my thing, is to show all of these pieces that are sometimes hard to pull together, especially if you have a preference for certain type of information, but you don't read other types of information. You'll never find the truth. The way that this brotherhood game is able to continue to flourish is because they hide some truth here, and 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 then they make you biased to where you will lean towards certain information, and you will categorically reject other information indiscriminately, just because of the nationality or the color of the person that wrote it, or because of the perspective or point of view politically of that particular person. They may have a religious ideology that you feel renders them incapable of teaching you anything, right? So for some folks, they glean information, but they only glean from certain sources. So what I wanted to do was I wanted us to broaden our horizons as a group. And again, as a researcher of these subjects and whatnot for 30 plus years, I have escaped that bias that makes you only read this and read that, because I understand how the game works now. But I had that bias also as a younger man. I wanted to read primarily about things that affected my community directly and things that affected me as a young black man and growing up in this strange new world. As I graduated in 1991. So I began to gather a lot of different information. I ran across a lot of interesting researchers. And in my latter years, David Mcgowan makes that list. He does not go as far as we go in some of the things that we say, but he does make those illusions and assumptions throughout his work. He did graduate from UCLA with a degree in psychology. He was born and raised in California, in Torrance, California, and he died at age 55, November 23rd, 2015. So 2015 was the year that we were reading his book. So without any further ado, let's get into his book. And I have a couple of books from him. The other one, I forget what it's called. I've got the one about Manson, but Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon really fits into the songwriter's secret narrative. And also, it fits somewhat into what we're experiencing in real time today, in the news media today, this week. For some time now, we've been hearing about these horrific events. Whether a person believes they're orchestrated or not orchestrated, once you have a true understanding of the Luciferian agenda, you will know that nothing is done without blood because their gods require it, number one. But number two, it really doesn't matter whether it was staged or not staged, because the rage and the outrage and the fear and the distrust and mistrust that it produces is very real. The prejudices that it helps to rekindle are very real prejudices. And having a worldview where you understand the Luciferian agenda and you know their end game, when you really understand that end game, you don't get so easily emotionally manipulated by the powers that should not be and their false god media. And the more that we revisit the old plans or the works of researchers and whistleblowers who give us greater insight into the deeper plans of the Brotherhood, we start to scratch some strange surfaces. And ironically, in reading Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, we're going to get into the plot of these groups, these secret groups, to create and cause a race war. The kings of the earth who come together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. There is even biblically a record in Psalm 2 and 2 that does indeed tells us that there is a worldwide conspiracy. And I was thinking, because I didn't want to use that word, that word's been vilified, but a conspiracy just means where two or more people are working together for a goal. So it's well understood by folks in a lot of areas of life that this is real. But then there are some folks for whom that idea is too much to grasp. And they push back, especially when we do the type of shows that we've done prior to the last two, where I was just playing and discussing with you John Todd and those those shows, that's different. But when we go through the songs and we discover what Patti LaBelle is really saying, and Somebody Loves You Baby, inevitably someone will come up and say, oh, well, you know, I don't think it's that deep. I don't think they're doing that. They love you. The brotherhood needs you. They feed off of you. They need for people to think, nah, they wouldn't do that. So when you get into weird scenes inside the canyon, you're going to get into Helter Skelter as well, which, according to Charles Manson and other researchers, that this was to ignite a race war. The idea of Helter Skelter is a code word for quote unquote race war. And whether they use crisis actors completely, or whether there are some crisis actors and some folks get sacrificed because the devil requires blood, it doesn't matter. It's still resulting in the hatred that needs to be generated in order for the black and white chessboard game of racism to culminate into an all-out war. That's part of why events like the events that we've heard so much about on the news in the past couple of weeks, that's one reason why they do those events. That's a reason that's often overlooked for various reasons. But sometimes just simply because the discussion of race is so touchy and sensitive that some people would rather miss the forest for the trees and not see that, yes, that's one of the agendas that they wish to accomplish. Everyone talks about they want to take your gat. We all know that. But very few people talk about their real intent to create some sort of, for lack of a better word, race war. So all of that is in play as we look at what we're going to look at today. And please believe me, the prayer request show and praise and worship show is on the way. It will follow this one. We're just going to take a little time to dive into this book. I'm going to read it straight through, and I'm going to pull up some visuals as I read. Okay? And then we're going to shut down after a couple of hours of that. I'm going to come immediately back. Please, any moderators in here, please pass this word on to other folks who happen to come in. Let them know that after this show, I'm going to come right back and we're going to do praise, worship, and prayer. And then if the Lord says the same, tomorrow we can have our talent exposition, where people get a chance to just show their talent. It's a talent show. The talents that the Lord gave you. His gifts and talents without repentance. Okay, so now let's get into it. Dave Mcgowan. Again, he's got interviews. He's got lengthy interviews here for those who want to hear more things. Just type in Dave Mcgowan interview. And yes, there's a few famous Dave McGowans. So if you want to find about this one, you're going to have to find sources other than Wikipedia. But you can find a page on him in WikiSpooks. And of course, others have written about him too. So you can find stuff on the man, at least right now. So weird scenes inside the canyon. Before I read the forward and the preface, we're going to skip the forward and the preface now, and we're going to go straight to the beginning. The preface was really good, though. That's why we kind of stopped after the preface. But okay, let's start. Let's start there. All right, check it out. Here we go. It began innocently enough. In my normal everyday life, I spend a fair amount of time researching corruption and criminality in the realms of politics and law enforcement. Much of that research has taken me down some very dark and twisted paths. But this was going to be different. I was, after all, going to be vacationing in a lush tropical paradise And I really just wanted to turn my brain off for a couple of weeks and forget about all of that. Not long before this much anticipated break from reality, my eldest daughter had given me a copy of Michael Walker's Laurel Canyon, the inside story of rock and roll's legendary neighborhood, which chronicles the Los Angeles music scene of the late 1960s through the 1970s. It seemed like the ideal escapist entertainment that would undoubtedly conjure up many fond memories of the music that provided the soundtrack to my formative years. What could be further removed from my usual reading material? So he thought he was going to get a break by looking at something that had to do with rock and roll, the music that shaped his formative years. And a rude awakening he got. Let's look and see how. He says, as is often the case, though, things didn't work out exactly as planned. Alarm bells started going off in my head soon after arriving at my destination and diving into the book. What was this about secret underground tunnels connecting some of the iconic Laurel Canyon properties, huh? And what about all those mysterious fires that wiped away the homes of a number of prominent singers and musicians? And why were there so many violent deaths so closely associated with a scene that was supposed to be all about peace and love? And what of Walker's throwaway? Walker is Michael Walker. He's referring to the person that wrote Laurel Canyon, the inside story of rock and roll's legendary neighborhood, which his daughter had turned him on to. He says so. And what of Walker's throwaway mention of a secret fortified military installation sitting right smack dab in the middle of hippiedom? Once again, and what of the author's throwaway mention of a secret fortified military installation sitting right smack dab in the middle of hippiedom? And why did at least a few of America's new minstrels seem to come from career military families and from the world of covert intelligence operations? And how exactly do the casual allusions to pedophilia fit into this increasingly curious scene? So you see, he's got the pieces. While Walker, the previous writer, had done a decent job of telling the Laurel Canyon story from a mainstream perspective. Come on, Dave, take us to the underground. There seemed to be a much more intriguing story hidden in the details that he tended to cast aside as interesting, but largely meaningless incongruities. So this writer had found some things that were strange, but he tossed them aside as meaningless incongruities for the most part. So David says, before I was even halfway through my sorely needed rest and relaxation time, I was chomping at the bit to get back home and dig deeper into this story. And immediately upon my return, I began devouring everything I could find that had been written on the subject. Although I am regarded by many people as a conspiracy theorist, which is more often than not utilized as a pejorative term, I do all of my research through very mainstream channels. I am a big believer in the notion that the truth is out there, but don't expect it to be delivered to you in a tidy package by any mainstream media outlets. Finding that truth involves assembling a jigsaw puzzle of sorts, with the goal being to gather up all the bits and pieces of information that other writers tend to present as throwaway facts and or interesting anomalies. Sometimes those bits and pieces end up being no more than interesting anomalies, but past experience has taught me that if those divergent facts are properly assembled, a new picture often begins to emerge that is strikingly at odds with what is widely accepted as our consensus reality. And people are comfortable with that consensus reality and don't want to take the time or experience the discomfort that comes along with trying to put those puzzle pieces in an unorthodox positioning. At the end of the day, it is really all about pattern recognition. If, for example, just a few prominent Laurel Canyon musicians happen to come from military intelligence families, then we could probably safely write that off as an interesting but largely inconsequential aberration. But if an uncanny number of the leading lights of the Laurel Canyon scene grew up in such an environment, then that is clearly a meaningful pattern. And if a few of the new breed of stars happened to have violent death intrude upon their personal lives, then that would be a tragic but largely inconsequential fact. Coincidence, in other words, as we're taught to see it. Then that again is a distinguishing pattern, and one that has been all but ignored by other chroniclers of the scene. There is little doubt in my mind that this book will not be warmly received by all readers. In our celebrity-driven culture, calling into question the character and motivations of so many widely admired and respected figures from the entertainment community is never a good way to win popularity contests. And when those revered figures are overwhelmingly viewed as icons of various leftist causes, come on with it, it is definitely not the way to win fans among those who consider themselves to be liberals, progressives, or leftists. But while my sympathies lie solidly in the leftward flanks of the political spectrum, there are no sacred cows in either this book or in any of my past work. In other words, left can get it, right can get it. Left wing, right wing, same demon. I really have no agenda other than to seek out unspoken truths and better my own understanding of the world we live in. I have no political party affiliations and have never been associated in any way with any government or quasi-governmental entities. And for the record, I was not born into the world of military intelligence operations. My rather uneventful childhood was spent in a quiet slice of suburbia with 2 public school teachers as parents. I've never claimed to be in possession of any inside information or to have access to any highly placed confidential sources. My research and the views expressed in my work are very much my own. While almost all of my past and present literary contributions are generally regarded as being quite controversial, the individual facts contained in this volume are not really controversial at all. All of these facts, as previously noted, have been mined from very respectable mainstream sources. It is only the way that I have presented those facts, in other words, the way that I've chosen to assemble the puzzle, that makes them controversial. Think inside the box, boy. There will undoubtedly be those who will stridently claim that I have carefully cherry-picked my facts to paint an unnecessarily dark portrait of many of the iconic figures who make up the cast of this story. Anyone, so the argument goes, could be made to look bad through such a journalistic approach. I would strongly disagree with that assessment, however. Such criticisms, in my opinion, completely miss the point of this book, which is that when stripped of the usual spin that accompanies them, and when assembled so they become part of overriding patterns, these anomalous facts reveal truths that would not otherwise be visible. Another criticism I anticipate is that I did not go out and attempt to speak directly to the people who made up the scene. True enough. But the primary reason for that is that there is very little chance that the aging rock stars and their handlers would have wanted anything to do with me. Other chroniclers of the era have gained access to those involved, but that access has come, or so it appears to me, with a steep price in journalistic integrity. Talk about it. So yeah, if you get access, then that means they don't want you to write about this and don't mention that. The inevitable result is what amounts to puff pieces. with a mind-numbing sameness, with the same tired anecdotal stories uncritically told over and over again in the very same way, even when those stories can't possibly be true. Remember how we talked about the backstories? So I have no desire to serve as a publicist for the estates of Jim Morrison, John Phillips, or Frank Zappa, nor do I have any interest in filling the pages of this book with the same apocryphal tales told by other scribes. There are any number of literary offerings listed in the bibliography that will provide that type of a reading experience. My goal here is to break new ground and open readers' minds to the possibility that other writers may have left out some of the most important elements of this underreported tale. The story of the scene it played out in Laurel Canyon from the mid-1960s to the end of the 1970s is an endlessly fascinating one. It wasn't until fairly recently that the mainstream version of the tale was belatedly told, and even now it remains a story unknown by most of those who were not a part of it. Virtually everyone has heard of the Haight-Ashbury scene up north in San Francisco, but even most native Angelenos remain ignorant of the even larger music and counterculture scene that played out in the Hollywood Hills. It seems a bit odd that nearly a full half-century after the fact, the Haight of Haight-Ashbury is almost universally regarded as the birthplace of hippies and flower children, despite the fact that the Laurel Canyon scene preceded and largely inspired what became a parallel scene up north. Why is it that the Haight has been thrust into the spotlight for so long, while so little attention has been paid to the scene that spawned it? Perhaps the Laurel Canyon scene was hiding so many dark secrets that it was better to just let it lie undisturbed and put all the weight on the Haight. And perhaps it is now time to shine a light into some of the darker corners of the canyon and see what kind of skeletons might be hiding there. Are you ready? Chapter 1, Village of the Damned, by way of an introduction. And with each chapter, he starts it off with some lyrics that may be familiar to fans of this era of music. And in this one, he starts with, "There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear." Join me now, if you have the time, as we take a stroll down memory lane to a time nearly 5 decades ago, a time when America last had uniformed ground troops fighting a sustained and bloody battle to impose some decidedly Orwellian democracy on some sovereign nation. It is the first week of August 1964, and U.S. warships under the command of U.S. Navy Admiral George Stephen Morrison have allegedly come under attack while patrolling Vietnam's Tonkin Gulf. This event, subsequently dubbed the Tonkin Gulf Incident, will result in the immediate passing by the U.S. Congress of the obviously pre-drafted Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which will in turn quickly lead to America's deep immersion into the bloody Vietnam quagmire. The way that Alex Jones has always told it, and you can learn something from anybody. Alex Jones has said a lot of true things and has taught a lot of basic truther ideas to baby bear squares like myself at that particular time in my development. That's what I needed. But the way that Alex Jones would always put it was that the Tonkin Gulf incident was orchestrated as a way to draw the United States into Vietnam. So they used deception. They fired on their own ship and blamed it. Okay, and then you put the blame on the people that you want to go and invade or attack anyway. You attack yourself. You blame the people that you want to. Hitler did it with the Reichstag. We did it with the twins. in downtown Manhattan. Yes. Nero, the Emperor Nero did it. So it's been done throughout history. Okay. But what he's saying here is that U.S. Navy Admiral George Stephen Morrison is one of the key players in the Tonkin Gulf incident, which brought us into Vietnam, or which was used to bring us into the bloody Vietnam quagmire, quote unquote. Before it's over, well over 50,000 American bodies, along with literally millions of Southeast Asian bodies, will litter the battlefields of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. For the record, the Tonkin Gulf incident appears to differ somewhat from other alleged provocations that have driven this country to war. This was not, as we have seen so many times before, a false flag operation. This was not that, which is to say an operation that involves Uncle Sam attacking himself and then pointing an accusatory finger at someone else. It was also not, as we've also seen on more than one occasion, it was not an attack that was quite deliberately provoked. No. What the Tonkin Gulf incident actually was, as it turns out, is an attack that never took place at all. Come on with it, David. He says, the entire incident, as has been all but officially acknowledged, was spun from whole cloth. It is quite possible, however, that the intent was to provoke a defensive response, which could have then been cast as an unprovoked attack on U.S. ships. The ships in question were on an intelligence mission and were operating in a decidedly provocative manner. It is quite possible that when Vietnamese forces failed to respond as anticipated, then Uncle Sam decided to just pretend as though they had. Let's just act like they did attack us. Nevertheless, by early February 1965, the U.S. will, without a declaration of war and with no valid reason to wage one, begin indiscriminately bombing North Vietnam. By March of that same year, the infamous Operation Rolling Thunder will commence. Over the course of the next 3.5 years, millions of tons of bombs, missiles, rockets, incendiary devices, and chemical warfare agents will be dumped on the people of Vietnam in what can only be described as one of the worst crimes against humanity ever perpetrated on this planet. Also in March of 1965, the first uniformed U.S. soldier officially sets foot on Vietnamese soil. What did we say about March and the waging of war? How they like to wage war during March. The military calls what they do when they're walking, they call it marching. March is a derivative of the word Mars. Mars was the Roman version of Ares, astrologically known as the god of war. They're into this. They believe these beings actually exist and that they can commune with them and receive powers from them, doing certain things on certain days as a sacrifice to them. So the men who die on the battlefield, whether it be today in Russia or the Ukraine, or whether it be yesteryear in Vietnam, those people constitute the blood sacrifice that is required in demonology. If you don't understand that, that's fine. But don't argue with someone who does. Now, let's move on. It says, the ships in question, pardon me. It is quite possible, however, that the intent was to provoke, pardon me, I jumped all the way up to the top. Okay, also in March of 1965, the first uniformed U.S. soldier officially sets foot on Vietnamese soil, although special forces units masquerading as advisors and trainers had already been in Vietnam for at least 4 years, and likely much longer. By April 1965, fully 25,000 uniformed American kids, because these folks that went to go fight for their country were mostly teenagers. Most still teenagers, barely out of high school, are slogging through the rice paddies of Vietnam. By the end of the year, U.S. troop strength will have surged to 200,000. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world in those early months of 1965, a new scene is just beginning to take shape in the city of Los Angeles. In a geographically and socially isolated community known as Laurel Canyon, a heavily wooded, rustic, serene, yet vaguely ominous slice of L.A., nestled in the hills that separate the Los Angeles basin from the San Fernando Valley. For some reason, musicians, singers, and songwriters suddenly begin to gather as though summoned there by some unseen Pied Piper. Within months, the hippie flower child movement is begotten there, along with the new style of music that will provide the soundtrack for the tumultuous second half of the 1960s and that hippie movement. Beginning in the mid-1960s and carrying through the decade of the 1970s, an uncanny number of rock music superstars will emerge from Laurel Canyon. So it says you can't rest on your laurels. We looked that up, right? That's the name of the reef that you see on a Caesar, or that you usually see on Julius Caesar. That's a laurel. It is a symbol used by royalty, a type of crown. Interestingly enough, let's move on. I said I was going to pull up some pictures. It's going to be hard to read with a certain rhythm and then pull up pictures, but I will when we just need to see the picture, y'all. I will. Okay. The first one of these superstars, or the first one of these superstars to drop an album, is the Birds, BYRDS, whose biggest star will prove to be David Crosby. Remember John Todd talked about his conversations with David Crosby? The band's debut effort, Mr. Tambourine Man, is released on the summer solstice of 1965. Now I told you, Brother Dave, I try to mess with the heavy hitters. I know about a lot of them. We just haven't gotten. We just haven't gotten around to all of them just yet. But it's a lot of heavy hitters in the truther game. I've heard of them all, listened to them all. At one point in time, I was thirsty enough for this information to give anybody a try. Jordan Maxwell, and the list goes on and on. They're going to be playing that for long. The police will be pulling up on somebody. And they're going to have a very unhappy night. Okay, let's move on. I don't know what's going on. Something happening downstairs. I'm upstairs, minding my own. But I pray in the name of Jesus that all is well, and that he will set the crooked things straight, protect his own as he promises to do. His word cannot return to him as void. All right, okay, so let's move on. All right, so he says here, the first to drop an album is the Birds, whose biggest star will prove to be David Crosby. The band's debut effort, Mr. Tambourine Man, is released on the summer solstice of 1965. It will quickly be followed by releases from the John Phillips-led Mamas and the Papas, If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears, came out January 1966, was the Rosemary's Baby alumni when we did our expose or breakdown of Rosemary's Baby. We talked about the importance of the year 1966 to the Luciferian Brotherhood. Okay, Love with Arthur Lee is the next release that came out, and these are all in order. That came out in May 1966. Love was the name of the album. Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, Freak Out, came out in 666, June 1966. Buffalo Springfield, featuring Stephen Stills and Neil Young, the album called Buffalo Springfield, that came out just in time for Samhain, October 1966, and ending with The Doors, January 1967. All of these were quick releases, as if there was some sort of meeting, an agreement. Okay, you come out this month. The way these are spaced apart but bunched together, this is how you create a movement. People say, oh, our culture, our culture. People take your culture and they take your movements and they create cultures and create movements right up under your nose and make you think that it's yours because this is what they want you to have. And this was no exception because this was the music. This was the hip hop of the time. Let's put it where it go. Yes, it talked about peace and love and togetherness and didn't talk about pimps and hoes and selling dope. But I mean, this was the music of the young people. And of course, we know that at one time there was a plethora of subjects that you could find within the genre of quote unquote so-called hip hop. But this was the music that was shaping the young minds at that time. Young people listened to these albums that we just named. So this shaped the culture. Also during wartime is a time when propaganda is at its highest. Not just in this country, but in any country. You watch a special about Nazi Germany. During wartime, it's most important to push out propaganda and to get the hearts and the minds of the people, as W so famously said, to get the hearts and the minds of the people, which is a form of control, mind control, behavior modification. That's also getting the hearts and minds of the people, and that's what they mean. So this was what Mr. Mcgowan is building up to, is that this was also behavior modification. These groups, this hippie movement. We've also touched on this idea, but yes, this was, Berkeley, where he went to school at. Berkeley was a big center for hippie ideology and the hippie quote unquote movement. And again, it appears that this movement was one that was made to look like it belonged to the young people, when in fact there were puppeteers pulling the strings from very, very high levels above those young people. Young, impressionable, goofy minds. Young, dumb, and chewing bubble gum. But let's move on. And they could sell them on these ideas. So one of the earliest on the Laurel Canyon, Morrison. I suppose that's worth it. Val Kilmer, I believe, played Jim Morrison. I was going to show y'all a picture, but y'all can look up Jim Morrison. Everybody here knows who Jim Morrison is, right? The Lizard King. I'm sure he's been sampled. But I can't think of something that he sampled for folks to know. But Jim Morrison, he's considered a legend. He's in the 27 Club too, right? 27 Club. Do the math right quick. Yep. Legend. The Lizard King, Mr. Mojo. Things that he called himself, the Lizard King. I mean, come on. The conspiracy theory people here, I'm sure, are drawing a bunch of conclusions. But this is Jim Morrison. He was considered a heartthrob and all of that, okay? All right, now let's get back to it. A very important player in the hippie culture, or in the hippie counterculture movement is what they called it. It was supposed to look like it was against the powers that be, like hip hop at one time. Looked like it was against the powers that be so much I thought it was. I still struggle with that to this day. I wonder, was it ever? I think we're certain that certain artists were against the powers that be, but was all of this orchestrated like it seems that the Laurel Canyon hippie movement was orchestrated? I think so. But let's read and see. It says, one of the earliest on the Laurel Canyon Sunset Strip scene is Jim Morrison, the enigmatic lead singer of the Doors. Doors, doorways, gateways, portals. Jim will quickly become one of the most iconic, controversial, critically acclaimed, and influential figures in non-singing. He is a struggle voice all-star, Hall of Famer, lead scorer. But Jim will quickly become one of the most iconic, controversial, critically acclaimed, and influential figures to take up residence in Laurel Canyon. Curiously enough, though, the self-proclaimed Lizard King has another claim to fame as well, albeit one that none of his numerous chroniclers will feel is of much relevance to his career and possibly to his untimely death. He is the son, as it happens, of the aforementioned Admiral George Stephen Morrison, involved in the Lord have mercy, involved in the Tonkin Gulf incident. And so it is that even while the father is actively conspiring to fabricate an incident that will be used to massively accelerate an illegal war, the son is positioning himself to become an icon of the hippie anti-war crowd. Well, now where they do that at? The father represents the war side. The son represents the anti-war side. Remember how the devil plays the game. He's playing both the black and the white side of the chessboard. If you control both sides, that's how the Hegelian dialectic works so well for them. Because quite often they control both sides. They control the Democrats and the Republicans. I hate to hear loved ones, people I know that are smart, fall for the, every time old slow Joe try to do something, the Republicans come in. Black folks are so programmed with that. No, they play together. They work together. Devils on both sides. The Republicans and the Democrats sit down together and they break bread and baby backs and everything else together behind closed doors. They have to give us the illusion of choice. So they have to give the illusion of, you can pick this or you can pick that. See, you have freedom of choice. When whichever one you pick, they're controlling. So that's a very crystal example of that, in that Morrison's dad, for the war machine, Morrison postures as one who is against the war machine, which sometimes children rebel. So let's read further. Let's see what happened. And so it is that even while the father is actively conspiring to fabricate an incident that will be used to massively accelerate an illegal war, the son is positioning himself to become an icon of the hippie anti-war crowd. Nothing unusual about that, I suppose. It is, a small world and all. This is David being facetious. And it is not as if Jim Morrison's story is in any way unique. During the early years of its heyday, Laurel Canyon's father figure is the rather eccentric personality known as Frank Zappa. Most people don't know who Frank Zappa is. You should know who Frank Zappa is. He's played with some of the greats. And he's considered to be a legend. Might as well put him right here. We gotta look at Jim Morrison no more. Jim Morrison of the Doors, and then we got Frank Zappa, who I believe even put his children into the business. Lots of his interviews and whatnot give you the impression that he's staunchly and vehemently anti-system, anti-government, for lack of a better word. He really gives you the impression that he's for the struggle. He's for the struggle. You know, interviews and things I've seen from him. That's the image, again, that they're all supposed to play if this is part of some Hegelian dialectic play. They're all supposed to play the image of, oh yeah, we're against the machine. Then you let them in. The same thing they did with the way they infiltrated the Panthers and other groups. They send somebody into that counterculture who represents it, who really reps it to the fullest. The people embrace that person. They push that person up. That person gets close to the leader or themselves. You know, they get some sort of leadership within the group. And the next thing you know, now the government is able to control the group through that person or persons. Because they didn't just put one person in as an infiltrator. Okay? So he says, during the early years of its heyday, Laurel Canyon's father figure is the rather eccentric personality known as Frank Zappa. Though he and his various mothers of invention lineups will never attain the commercial success of the band headed by the Admiral's son, old Frank will be a hugely influential figure among his contemporaries. Ensconced in a abode dubbed the Log Cabin, which sat right in the heart of Laurel Canyon, at the crossroads of Laurel Canyon Boulevard and Lookout Mountain Avenue. Zappa will play host to virtually every musician who passes through the canyon in the mid to late 1960s. He will also discover and sign numerous acts to his various Laurel Canyon-based record labels. Many of these acts will be rather bizarre and somewhat obscure characters. Think Captain Beefheart and Larry Wildman Fisher. But some of them, such as psychedelic rocker, come shock rocker, Alice Cooper, will go on to superstardom. And I do believe that we looked up those groups back in 2015, probably at the suggestion of my brother, my main man, JJ. Now it says, Zappa, along with certain members of his sizable entourage, the Log Cabin was run as an early commune. This is his White House, as the president or the father figure of this counterculture movement. The Log Cabin was his White House, and it was run as an early commune with numerous hangers-on occupying various rooms in the main house and the guest house, as well as the peculiar caves and tunnels lacing the grounds of the home. Far from the quaint homestead the name seems to imply, the Log Cabin was a cavernous 5-level home that featured a 2,000-plus square foot living room with 3 massive chandeliers and an enormous floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace. Well, you can chuck more than wood in there. It will also be instrumental in introducing the look and attitude, or rather Zappa will also be instrumental in introducing the look and attitude that will define the hippie counterculture. And he looks awful warlocky, although the Zappa crew prefers the label freak. Nevertheless, Zappa will never really make a secret of the fact that he has nothing but contempt for the hippie culture that he will help create and with which he will surround himself. Given that Zappa is by various accounts a pro-military, rigidly authoritarian control freak, it is perhaps unsurprising that he will not feel a kinship with the youth movement that he will ironically help nurture. And it is probably safe to say that Frank's dad also would have had little regard for the youth culture of the 1960s, given that Francis Zappa was, in case you were wondering, a chemical warfare specialist. Yes. Assigned to where else? The Edgewood Arsenal near Baltimore, Maryland. Edgewood is, of course, the longtime home of America's chemical warfare program, as well as a facility frequently cited as being deeply enmeshed in MK Ultra operations. Curiously enough, Frank Zappa literally grew up at the Edgewood Arsenal, having lived the first 7 years of his life in military housing on the grounds of the facility. The family later moved to Lancaster, California, near Edwards Air Force Base, where Francis Zappa continued to busy himself doing classified work for the military intelligence complex. His son, meanwhile, prepped himself to become an icon of the peace and love crowd, or was prepped. Again, nothing unusual about that, I suppose. Now, Zappa's manager, here come the Coheens. Lord guide my tongue. Speaking of the 2 Niners, Lord help me. Okay, here we go. Zappa's manager is a shadowy character by the name of Herb Cohen, which means priest. The Jay-Z Rockefeller symbol that people often throw up and say, that's the Illuminati pyramid. If you type in the Cohen hands or the Kohanim hands, okay. And again, this could just be, oops. This is all coincidence and speculation, hearsay. There it is. The Kohanim hands, for plural. It's found on Jewish tombstones. It's a Jewish thing. See? There you go. All right. Okay. Cohen hands or Kohanim hands. Okay. So Herb Cohen, let's see. It says, Zappa's manager is a shadowy character by the name of Herb Cohen, who had come out to L.A. from the Bronx. Oh, really? Don't cast aspersions on people from the Bronx. But the gangster element in music didn't start with Suge Knight and Death Row. I just want to throw that out there. Some people didn't know. Okay, so it says, he came out to L.A. from the Bronx with his brother Mutt. Mutt and Herb from the Bronx. He came out to L.A. from the Bronx with his brother Mutt just before the music and club scene began heating up. Cohen, a former U.S. Marine, had spent a few years traveling the world before his arrival on the Laurel Canyon scene. Those travels, curiously, had taken him to the Congo in 1961 at the very time that leftist Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba was being tortured and killed by our very own CIA. Patrice Lumumba, I first heard of him listening to X-Clan. Again, historical and political figures from the past. But if you look at what was done in the past, you can understand better what's being done in the present and what's likely to be done in the future. Former Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. A Congolese politician and independence leader who served as the first Prime Minister of the Independent Democratic Republic of the Congo from June until September 1960. Okay, now, so, but what Mr. Mcgowan, the writer, is referring to is that the CIA did these type of operations, or did clandestine operations and assassinations around the world, although they denied doing so. Okay. So, again, Zappa's manager, this shadowy character by the name of Herb Cohen, came out to L.A. from the Bronx, accompanied with his brother Mutt, just before the music and club scene began to heat up. Cohen, a former U.S. Marine, had spent a few years traveling the world before his arrival on the Laurel Canyon. Seeing those travels, curiously, had taken him to the Congo in 1961. So was he involved? At the very time that leftist Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba was being tortured and killed by our very own CIA. Not to worry, though. According to one of Zappa's biographers, Cohen wasn't in the Congo on some kind of nefarious intelligence mission. No. He was there, on the contrary, to supply arms to Lumumba. Oh, duh, I should have had a V8. In defiance of the CIA. Because, you know, that is the kind of thing that globe-trotting ex-Marines did in those days, as we'll see soon enough when we take a look at another Laurel Canyon luminary. Now, making up the other half of Laurel Canyon's first family is Frank Zappa's wife, Gail Zappa, known formerly as Adelaide Sloatman. Oy vey. Gail hails from a long line of career naval officers, including her father, who spent his life working on classified nuclear weapons research for the U.S. Navy. Well, these are some big government peoples here that sired the children who would become the leaders of the hippie movement and the counterculture movement. That sound, that hippie sound. What a coincidence! Wow, they had this in common. Isn't that quaint? Gail hails from a long line of career naval officers, including her father. Gail Zappa, that is, hails from a long line of career naval officers, including her father, who spent his life working on classified nuclear weapons research for the U.S. Navy. Gail herself once worked as a secretary for the Office of Naval Research and Development. Oh. She also once told an interviewer that she had heard voices all her life. Many years before their nearly simultaneous arrival in Laurel Canyon, Gail had attended a naval kindergarten class with Mr. Mojo Rising himself, Jim Morrison. Now, what a coincidence. This had to be meant to be. That's what it is. Serendipity, synchronicity, the universe. Well, I don't see the connection, Brother Theo. Things just happen like that sometimes. It's just, sometimes things just happen. There's no correlation between those events. She also once told an interviewer that she had heard voices all of her life, many years before their nearly simultaneous arrival in Laurel Canyon. So Gail Zappa, who would end up being Frank Zappa's wife, and Jim Morrison just happened to arrive in Laurel Canyon at the same time. But many years before, they happened to have a naval kindergarten class together. Jim Morrison, it is claimed that as a child, Gail once hit Jim over the head with a hammer. The very same Jim Morrison had later attended this little crazy children of crazy adults. Beyond crazy, megalomaniac, psychopathic, sociopathic, maniacal, demonic. Okay. The very same Jim Morrison had later attended the same Alexandria, Virginia. Where's the CIA at? The very same Jim Morrison had later attended the same Alexandria, Virginia high school as two other future Laurel Canyon luminaries. He happened to go to the same high school as John Phillips and Cass Elliot. The same high school that they would later go to. Now, Papa John Phillips, and again, I know some people, they just don't know who is he talking about. The mamas and the papas give us pictures of both mamas and the papas. There we go. The mamas and the papas. Okay. Okay. So Papa was John Phillips. Whose daughter became, or whose daughters was Wilson Phillips. You remember that one year where they was forcing Wilson Phillips down your throat? They were. They was everywhere with that subpar song. Anyway. So Papa John Phillips, more so than probably any of the other illustrious residents of Laurel Canyon, will play a major role in spreading the emerging youth counterculture across America. His counterculture movement, or his contribution, will be twofold. First, what John Phillips will do is he will co-organize the famed Monterey Pop Festival, which helped to promote the counterculture hippie movement to people who hadn't heard of it and didn't know what it was. That was their introduction. That was the Burning Man, or the pre-Woodstock. So his contribution will be twofold. First, he will co-organize the famed Monterey Pop Festival. You got to make a festival where you can promote this counterculture that you create for the people to have, or this false flag counterculture, pseudo counterculture. It's really controlled opposition. And the Monterey Pop Festival, through unprecedented media exposure, will give mainstream America its first real look at the music and fashions of the nascent hippie movement. From hippie to hip hop. Second, what Phillips also did, Phillips will pen he says second, Phillips will pen an insipid song known as San Francisco. Be sure to wear flowers in your hair, which will quickly rise to the top of the charts. And who's in control of that? Who makes sure certain things reach the top of the charts and certain things never will? Along with the Monterey Pop Festival, the song San Francisco, San Francisco, if you're going to San Francisco. Okay, along with the Monterey Pop Festival, the song will be instrumental in luring the disenfranchised, a preponderance of whom will be underage runaways, luring them to San Francisco to create the Haight-Ashbury phenomenon and the famed 1967 Summer of Love. So you could say that John Phillips was inspired to write the song that really kicked it off. Inspired by what spirit? That's huge. What David Mcgowan just said there in that sentence, he left it loaded with a lot of things. For one thing, the majority of the young people who were leaving, teenage girls was traveling all the way from Wisconsin and New York and Chicago to go all the way to San Francisco to go see what this hippie community was about, to go be a part of the counterculture movement. Hey, we're young and we're hip. This is our people, our generation. They're speaking to us. We should be a part of it. And by and large, there was a disproportionate amount of those young kids who came, let's call them what they were, young children who came, were girls. Now remember what's up under President Frank Zappa's White House? The log cabin? Caverns? Let's move on. So that song, and it is insipid, that song really was a kickoff. Before arriving in Laurel Canyon and opening the doors of his home to the soon-to-be famous, the already famous, and the infamous, such as Charlie Manson, whose Manson family also spent time at the log cabin and at the Laurel Canyon home of Mama Cass Elliott, which, in case you didn't know, sat right across the road from the Laurel Canyon home of Abigail Folger and Wojtek Frykowski. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here. John Edmund Andrew Phillips, John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas, the Papa in the Mamas and Papas. John Edmund Andrew Phillips was, shockingly enough, yet another child of the military intelligence complex. Get out of here. What's the mathematical odds? The son of U.S. Marine Corps Captain Claude Andrew Phillips and a mother who claimed to have psychic and telekinetic powers. So his dad's military, his mom's a witch. John attended a series of elite military prep schools in the Washington, D.C. area, culminating in an appointment to the prestigious U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. After leaving Annapolis, John married Susie Adams. Do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do. You can't make this stuff up. After leaving Annapolis, John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas, Papa John, essentially, okay. Has your wig blown yet? After leaving Annapolis, Papa John married Susie Adams, a direct descendant of founding father John Adams. And Charles Adams also was the writer of the original comic strip The Addams Family, which became the TV show, which became the cartoons and movies that they're still shoving down your throat because of the theme. Making evil fair seem. Making the wicked and the dark funny. Ha ha ha, put a laugh track to it. Ha 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 ha. That's how you desensitize people to witchcraft. But let's move on. So of course John wanted a woman like dear old mom. We don't know if all the Adamses, according to the show, and you listen to Morticia and Gomez talk in the older show, and they often talk about their family and their relatives and how far back the witchcraft and warlockery and wizardry goes in their family. I have a video about that called Family Tree or something like that. Anybody interested in that, just put it in the comments and I'll send you a link to that video breaking down the Addams family, the family of Mr. Adams. But yes, he was the same Adams, or rather his last name was because he was a direct descendant of founding father John Adams as well. Okay, so John Phillips, Papa John, marries a direct descendant of founding father John Adams. Wow. Susie's father James Adams, Susie is the girl that Papa John married that was of the Adams family bloodline. So Susie's dad was named James Adams Jr. He had been involved in what Susie described as cloak and dagger stuff with the Air Force in Vienna, or what others like to call covert intelligence operations. Susie herself would later find employment at the Pentagon. What? Alongside John Phillips' older sister, Rosie, who also dutifully reported to work at the complex, the Pentagon, for nearly 30 years. This is too much to touch. Now do you see why we wanted to look into this book? Because, again, it helps folks make certain connections that us just talking about it and listening to the music may not make for them. Some people think in a more right brain way, some people in a more left brain way. We want to get as much balance going on as possible because you're going to need both of them, trust me. So John Phillips' older sister, Rosie, dutifully reported to work at the Pentagon for nearly 30 years. John's mother, Dean Phillips, also worked for most of her life for the federal government in some unspecified capacity. And John's older brother, Tommy, was a battle-scarred former U.S. Marine who found work on the Alexandria Police Force, Alexandria, Virginia, on the Alexandria Police Force as a cop, albeit one with a disciplinary record for exhibiting a violent streak when dealing with people of color. And this is David Mcgowan's words, not mine. Interesting how all of these things kind of run together. So Papa John, brother, was a racist cop. His sister worked for the Pentagon. It was just, wow, it's a lot of brotherhood connections. The brotherhood or Freemasonry or sororities and fraternities are a big deal when you're in government jobs and positions. That's one more point of reference that we have, or one more commonality that I have with this coworker here. Oh yeah, me and him both pledged Kappa. That's a big thing in those highfalutin government jobs. That might be the difference between whether you get promoted or not. Well, it's also a big thing in the police. Dudes that had certain awards or medals from being in battle, those guys tend to get a different type of treatment from their fellow co-workers in the police department, and oftentimes, looked up to and promoted more so. Okay. So, John Phillips, of course, though surrounded throughout his life by military intelligence personnel, did not involve himself in such matters. Oh, no. Or so we are to believe. Before succeeding in his musical career, however, John did seem to find himself quite innocently, of course, in some rather unusual places. Now, Brother David, what you about to try to say? You about to tell us that Papa John was out here smoking fools for the CIA? Did you guys know that at one time Elvis Presley had the record for being the best sharpshooter in the United States? He went to meet with the president because of it. They say he was awful proud to show people the citation that they gave him. Born Identity, anyone? Red Sonja? Wasn't she one too? A Long Kiss Goodnight. Anyone? Okay, let's move on. Forget it. Let's move on. Okay. Before succeeding in his musical career, however, Papa John did seem to find himself, quite innocently of course, in some rather unusual places. One such place was Havana, Cuba, where Phillips just happened to arrive at the very height of the Cuban Revolution. For the record, Phillips has claimed that he went to Havana as nothing more than a concerned private citizen with the intention of, you're going to love this, fighting for Castro. Because, as I mentioned earlier, of course, a lot of folks in those days traveled abroad to thwart CIA operations before taking up residence in Laurel Canyon and joining the hippie generation. All of that is the writer being facetious. So, of course, all of these superstar entertainers traveled abroad to try to thwart the efforts of the CIA before they all decided to get together and live in the same area and join the hippie movement, right? During the 2 weeks or so that the Cuban Missile Crisis played out, a few years after Castro took over, Phillips found himself cooling his heels in Jacksonville, Florida, alongside the Mayport Naval Station. Anyway, let's move on to yet another of Laurel Canyon's earliest and brightest stars. Mr. Stephen Stills of Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Stills will have the distinction of being a founding member of two, not just one, of two of Laurel Canyon's most acclaimed and beloved bands, Buffalo Springfield, and needless to say, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. In addition, Stills will pen perhaps the first and certainly one of the most enduring anthems of the 60s generation, For What It's Worth, the opening lines of which appear at the top of this chapter. Stills' follow-up single will be entitled, are you holding on to your seats? Isn't this some surprisingly heavyweight jamming? Are you ready? The opening lines, Stills' follow-up single will be entitled Bluebird, which coincidentally, or not, happens to be the original code name assigned to the CIA's MK Ultra program. Hello. Before his arrival in Laurel Canyon, Stephen Stills, and again, got young people in the house. Crosby, Stills, and Nash, what is that? Sounds like something that they sell at Abercrombie and Fitch. Let's see. Here we go. And then, of course, they became Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. On a desert. Let me see. Okay. Interesting. The Grateful Dead. Is that the Grateful Dead's logo? For real, for real? I'm just curious. Can anybody that's actually listening tell me that? It's got to be. No. This is their official logo. This thing here. What is that? Is that the album cover? What is this? What is this? This ain't one of the most Masonic symbols I've ever seen in my life. The meanings of it. Wow. That's hard. Yeah, the skull here. The skull with the lightning bolt. We know what the lightning bolt means. We know what the red and the blue means. Yeah, but I wasn't looking for the Grateful Dead. Like I said, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. That's what he was looking for. So let's go back to that. Okay. Because I know they're all going to come up. And let's pull up a still picture of Stills. In the desert, on a horse with no name. That'll just give me a record deal. I can sing good as all these people. Stephen Stills. No, I'm just kidding. Of course, I don't want one. There he is. And I actually do like that song. It's a catchy song. Though I know it's on that other stuff. You're talking about that horse. If you want to ride, then ride the white horse. But anyway, definitely about drug use. He might have mixed it with peyote or whatever. I forget what I heard. But anyway, okay, so let's go back. Okay, so this is Stephen Stills, all right, of Crosby, Stills, and Nash. There's David Crosby. I know his face when I see it. So that's got to be Nash. Okay. Let's get back to it. Before his arrival in Laurel Canyon, Stephen Stills was the product of yet another career military family. Raised partly in Texas, young Stephen spent large swaths of his childhood in El Salvador, Costa Rica, the Panama Canal Zone, and various other parts of Central America, alongside his father, who was, we can be fairly certain, helping to spread democracy, quote unquote, to the unwashed masses in that endearingly American way. As with the rest of our cast of characters, Stills was educated primarily at schools on military bases and at elite military academies. Among his contemporaries in Laurel Canyon, he was widely viewed as having an abrasive, authoritarian personality. Nothing unusual about any of that, of course, as we have already seen. There is, however, an even more curious aspect to the Stephen Stills story. Stephen will later tell anyone who will sit and listen that he had served time for Uncle Sam in the jungles of Vietnam. These tales will be universally dismissed by chroniclers of the era as nothing more than drug-induced delusions. Such a thing couldn't possibly be true, it will be claimed, since Stills arrived on the Laurel Canyon scene at the very time that the first uniformed troops began shipping out, and he remained in the public eye thereafter. So when did you have any time to fight in Vietnam, man? You've been singing and performing all of this time, and singers don't get sent off to war. They entertain the troops. We've seen Bob Hope, a handler mentioned many times in Bryce Taylor's book Transformation of America. But what's being alluded to here is that it's quite possible that Stephen Stills told the truth. That the drug-induced behavior was him telling something that they would have rather he shut up about. Be quiet. Don't talk about that. We sent you on a couple of missions to test out your MK Ultra. Let's move on. So, again, Stephen will later tell anyone who will sit and listen that he had served time for Uncle Sam in the jungles of Vietnam. These tales will be universally dismissed by chroniclers of the era as nothing more than his drug-induced delusion. Such a thing couldn't possibly be true, they claim, since Stills arrived on the Laurel Canyon scene at the same time that the first uniformed troops began shipping out, and he remained in the public eye thereafter. And it will, of course, be quite true that Stephen Stills could not have served with uniformed ground troops in Vietnam, but what will be ignored is the undeniable fact that the U.S. had thousands of quote-unquote advisors, which is to say, CIA Special Forces operatives, active in the country for a good many years before the arrival of the first official ground troops. What will also be ignored is that, given his background, his age, and the timeline of events, Stephen Stills not only could have seen action in Vietnam, he would seem to have been a prime candidate for such an assignment. After which, of course, he could rather quickly become, stop me if you've heard this one before, an icon of the peace generation. Another of those icons, in one of Laurel Canyon's most flamboyant resident, Johnny. is a young man by the name of David Crosby, founding member of the seminal Laurel Canyon band, the Byrds, as well as, of course, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. So let's pull up David Crosby right quick, because I think this needs to be said. I think it needs to be said that David Crosby, when I first heard John Todd talk about how David Crosby told him, oh yeah, you know, we've all got to know the craft if you want to be a producer nowadays. He looks like a crazy, crotchety old dude now. But David Crosby, this is him when younger, had a look to me like this man wouldn't hurt a fly. You couldn't have told me this guy got something to do with the devil or the military operations behind closed doors or satanic military operations. I would have told you to go jump in a lake. I would have said, you're tripping. There's no way that's possible. Look at this guy. Just to show you how looks deceive, and how also there's also this element within the entertainment aspect of the brotherhood. There's this element of like dudes that are really gangster want to be not seen that way. Slick Rick was really gangster. By definition, killed his cousin, robbery or whatever the case might have been. It was so shocking for me to hear that Slick Rick went to jail for murder. It was almost devastating and unbelievable to me at the same time. I remember finding out, when I found out that Barry White was a very active member of his gang, according to him. He was telling it himself, and the whole time he was telling it, he was flipping the OK sign while he was doing it. He was letting it be known, I was a very loyal member of my gang. But his image gives you something different. So keep that in mind too. The nerdy ones, they want to be seen as the gangsters. They want to be feared. Imagine the nerd that Marilyn Manson was. He was such the nerd at one time that they used to say that the nerd from the Wonder Years, I know nerd is it's a slanderous name for someone who's smarter than you. But using conversational terms so we can get through the conversation. Marilyn Manson appeared to be such a nerd that they thought that kid from the Wonder Years was him. For a minute, I remember that was the rumor going around. But my point is, you can tell, super nerd. So now you want to be the most quote unquote, and I'm using this as a term, it's a term that people use. Now you want to be the most bad A so-and-so out there, right? You're really bad A because I worship Satan. I'm a real badass. I'm a really tough guy. Right? Okay, so let's see what it says about David Crosby. Okay, David Crosby, founding member of the seminal Laurel Canyon band, the Byrds. Rick James ended up hooking with them too, right? Isn't that what we had read in the Rick James book? Okay. Member of the seminal Laurel Canyon band, the Byrds, as well as, of course, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Crosby is, not surprisingly, the son of an Annapolis graduate and World War II military intelligence officer, Major Floyd Delafield Crosby. Like others in this story, Floyd Crosby spent most of his post-service time traveling the world, like their other fathers. Those travels landed him in places like Haiti, where he paid a visit in 1927 when the country just happened to be, coincidentally of course, under military occupation by the U.S. Marines. One of the Marines doing that occupying was a guy that we met a little earlier in this book, a guy by the name of Captain Claude Andrew Phillips. But David Crosby is much more than just the son of Major Floyd Delafield Crosby. David Van Cortlandt Crosby, as it turns out, I know they was beating him up, as it turns out, is a scion of the closely intertwined Van Cortlandt, Van Schuyler, and Van Rensselaer families. And while you're probably thinking the Van Who families, I can assure you that if you plug those names in over at Wikipedia, you can spend a pretty fair amount of time reading up on the power wielded by this clan for the last, 2¼ centuries or so. Suffice it to say that the Crosby family tree includes a truly dizzying array of U.S. senators and congressmen, state senators and assemblymen, governors, mayors, judges, Supreme Court judges, Revolutionary and Civil War generals, signers of the Declaration of Independence, and members of the Continental Congress, all part of it. Also includes, I should hasten to add, for those of you with a taste for such things, it also includes more than a few high-ranking Masons. Stephen Van Rensselaer III, for example, reportedly served as Grand Master of Masons for all of New York. And if all that isn't impressive enough, according to the New England Genealogical Society, David Van Cortlandt Crosby is also a direct descendant of Founding Fathers and Federalist Papers authors Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. It's all connected, runs in the family. If there is, as many believe, a network of elite families that has shaped national and world events for a very long time, then it is probably safe to say that David Crosby is a bloodline member of that clan, which may explain, come to think of it, why his semen seems to be in such demand in certain circles. Because if we're being honest here, it certainly can't be due to his looks or talent. You get him, Dave. If America had royalty, then David Crosby would probably be a duke or a prince or something similar because of his bloodline. But other than that, he's just a normal, run-of-the-mill kind of guy who just happened to shine as one of Laurel Canyon's brightest stars, and who, I guess I should add, has a real fondness for guns. Did you know that? Especially handguns, which he has maintained a sizable collection of for his entire life. According to those closest to him, it is a rare occasion when Mr. Crosby is not packing heat. He got it on him at all times. John Phillips also owned and sometimes carried handguns. And, according to Crosby himself, he has on at least one occasion discharged a firearm in anger at another human being, all of which made him, of course, an obvious choice for the flower children to rally around. Thoughts and prayers to the families in Texas. Thoughts and prayers to all of those who are grieving and all of those who are fearful and nervous because of this latest increase in violence. Always, their goal is a means to an end. They'll go to any means to get to that end. And that end, for those who don't know, is the uncontested rule of Lucifer as king of the world. And they're going through many steps on the chessboard to get to that goal, and they will sacrifice many pieces on that board. But let's move on. Okay. And then and as I tie this chapter up, we're going to read a chapter per reading, and then we're going to talk about that chapter. I'm going to open up the phone lines. And for those who did not hear, because they were not here, we're going to open up the phone lines for a short time, and then we're going to jump into prayer and praise and worship music and prayer requests in a separate show. So I'm doing 2 shows tonight because we have a lot of ground that needs to be covered. We don't want to leave the lessons that we were lacing people up. We don't want to leave those shoes unlaced too long, lest ye may trip. So I wanted to tie up those laces a little bit, and I felt that it would be good to kind of put a cap on the songwriter's secret conversation by reading the weird scenes inside the canyon, because we need to get back to focusing on kingdom business, the word, prayer, the signs that follow them that believe. And so that's what we're going to be doing more so. I do understand the importance of these lessons because they bring people in who otherwise would not come. And although I feel that I've made it clear that that's what I'm more concerned about than anything else, I don't want it to get misconstrued and for people to think I'm neglecting this or neglecting that in lieu of something that may seem trivial for a lot of folks. But these type of things, these type of discussions not only brought me closer to God and further from the devil, which is what I needed to be, but I've seen it happen in so many others. People who just don't really know if they should put a stock in anything God and the devil wise. And it was through the study of these subjects and understanding how this world really works and the way things are really structured, that I could not escape that the devil is real and that the Bible is real. Leave it alone, read it just like it is, with the Holy Spirit as your guide. You don't need no extras. You don't need this, you don't need that. The devil is trying every way he can to try to keep you from reading the book, knowing that he couldn't ever get away with just saying, hey, stop reading it. He figured out ways. Oh, well, there's the Pauline doctrine. There's people say, oh, well, I don't mess with the part that Paul wrote. Oh, then there's the people that say, oh, well, I don't mess with the Old Testament. We are free from the law and bondage, and we had nothing to do with it no more. And then there's people that say, oh, well, we just deal with the Old Testament because that, we don't know what Paul and them was up to, and Jesus said things that didn't go along with what the Father said. And then the Mandela effect. People, oh, well, we believe in the whole Bible, but we just think it's been changed. And each one of these beliefs comes directly from Freemasonry. I know these beliefs from Freemasonry before y'all would come to me and say, and of course not all of you, but different ones would come to me and say, hey, Brother Theo, have you heard this theory? Yes, I heard that theory. I heard that theory when I was a non-believer. And now Christians are embracing these crazy theories. I wanted to say it. These wild-assed theories, because they make you like a wild ass as opposed to like a disciple that has discipline. Read it all. Get some people to help you understand things where you feel I need to throw this out and throw that out. No, you need to understand that better. You need an elder to help you to understand that. The elders who obtained a good report. The elders whose faith was counted as righteousness. They can't halfway count faith nowadays as righteousness because ain't nobody got no faith. And damn sure ain't got no righteousness. We're all struggling to do the best that we can. And some people are striving to be better human beings today than they were yesterday, and they strive to be better tomorrow than they were today. That's always my prayer. I don't expect for nobody to be perfect. I understand that. But doggone it, follow what the elders did. You know where some of your elders ended up. You know you got some elders that's where they supposed to be. I don't know where you gonna end up when you die, bringing these strange doctrines to me. Do it the way they did it, and you'll be and remain free. So let's move on. Jackson Brown. Here's another one. Sorry, I just had to say that. So yes, after this show, for those who are interested in that part of what we bring on this channel, you are welcome to come. If you're not interested, don't come. Anybody making you come? You can stay where you at. And those of us who want to pray and who want to listen to praise and worship music, that's what we're going to do. But if you come in there with your foolishness, I can forget my best self too. I don't want to. But no, the new policy at the age of 49 is, for trolls, I ain't got no time, kids. Don't feed them. Don't give them no attention. They'll dry up and die. So here's Jackson Brown. The Teddy Bear's Picnic. He had a song for that? The Teddy Bear's Picnic is a comedy version. It's a comedy based off of the, what is it called? The Bohemian Grove. It's a comedy based off the Bohemian Grove. He did a song for that? Can somebody confirm? Have you seen the Teddy Bear's Picnic? Anyway, another shining star on the Laurel Canyon scene just a few years later, after Crosby, will be singer-songwriter Jackson Brown, who is, are you getting as bored with this as I am? He is the product of a career military family. Brown's father was assigned to post-war reconstruction work in Germany, which very likely means that he was in the employ of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. As readers of my earlier work, Understanding the F Word, may recall, U.S. involvement in post-war reconstruction in Germany largely consisted of maintaining as much of the Nazi infrastructure as possible while shielding war criminals from capture pardon me, and prosecution. And the F word is fascist, just in case you're wondering. Against that backdrop, Jackson Brown was born in a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. Some 2 decades later, he emerged as ... or ellipsis. Oh, never mind. That's what he says. So in other words, he tell you it's the same story over and over and over again. Let's talk instead about 3 other Laurel Canyon vocalists who will rise to dizzying heights of fame and fortune. Who you talking about? He said Jerry Beckley, Dan Peake, and Dewey Bunnell. Jerry Beckley, Dan Peake, listen to that in here. Dan Peake. And the last one is Bunnell. Dewey Bunnell. No dude named Dewey. Okay. See what it says about them. I'm unfamiliar with these guys. Individually, these 3 names are probably unknown to virtually all readers, but collectively, as the band America, The three will score huge hits in the early 70s with such songs as Ventura Highway and A Horse with No Name. Okay. I would always confuse him. Okay. I know y'all was probably going crazy in the comments like, The Horse with No Name is not by him. Horse with No Name is you've got it mixed up, Brother Theo. Okay. Hope you didn't have an aneurysm behind that. But okay. I forgot that. Now, back to my recollection. Yes, Horse with No Name is by America, of course, right? Okay. And The Wizard of Oz, the Tin Man, or you never give nothing to the Tin Man that he didn't already have, or something like that. I know that, yeah, I know that song. I guess I probably don't need to add here that all three of these lads were products of the military intelligence community. Beckley's dad was the commander of the now-defunct West Ruislip U.S. Air Force Base near London, England, a facility deeply immersed in intelligence operations. Bunnell's and Peake's fathers were both career Air Force officers serving under Beckley's dad at West Ruislip, which is where the three boys first met. We could also, I suppose, discuss Mike Nesmith of the Monkees. Hey, hey, we're the Monkees. Okay, I know that. And Corey Wells of Three Dog Night, two more hugely successful Laurel Canyon bands. They both arrived in L.A. not long after serving time with the U.S. Air Force. Nesmith also inherited a family fortune estimated at $25 million. He came into the game rich. Graham Parsons, is that the Parsons in relation to Alan Parsons? In relation to Jack Parsons? Graham Parsons, who will briefly replace David Crosby in the Birds before fronting the Flying Burrito Brothers, was the son of Major Cecil Ingram Coondog Connor II, a decorated military officer and bomber pilot who reportedly flew over 50 combat missions. Parsons was also an heir on his mother's side to the formidable Snively family fortune. Said to be the wealthiest family in the exclusive enclave of Winter Haven, Florida. The Snively family was the proud owner of Snively Groves Incorporated, which reportedly owned as much as 1/3 of all the citrus groves in the state of Florida. That's a lot of bread. Family really had the juice. Okay. And so it goes, as one scrolls through the roster of Laurel Canyon superstars. What one finds, far more often than not, are the sons and daughters of the military intelligence complex, and, and the sons and daughters of extreme wealth and privilege. Oftentimes, you'll find both rolled into one convenient package. Every once in a while, you will also stumble across a former child actor like Brandon DeWild, or Monkey Mickey Dolans, or eccentric prodigy Van Dyke Parks. You might also encounter some former mental patients, such as James Taylor, who spent time in 2 different mental institutions in Massachusetts before hitting the Laurel Canyon scene, or Larry Wildman Fisher, who was institutionalized repeatedly during his teen years, once for attacking his mother with a knife, an act that was gleefully mocked by Zappa on the cover of Fisher's first album. Finally, you might find the offspring of an organized crime figure, like Warren Zevon, the son of William Stumpy Zevon, a lieutenant for infamous L.A. crime lord Mcgowan. All these folks gathered nearly simultaneously along the narrow, winding roads of Laurel Canyon. They came from across the country, although the Washington, D.C. area was noticeably overrepresented, as well as from Canada and England. And in at least one case, they came all the way from Nazi Germany. They came even though at the time there was no music industry in Los Angeles. They came there even though at the time there was no music industry in Los Angeles. They came even though at the time there was no live music scene to speak of. They came even though, in retrospect, there was no discernible reason for them to do so. Organically. It would, of course, make sense these days for an aspiring musician to venture out to Los Angeles these days. But in those days, the centers of the music universe were Nashville, Memphis, and New York. It wasn't the industry that drew the Laurel Canyon crowd, you see, but rather the Laurel Canyon crowd that transformed Los Angeles into the epicenter of the music industry. To what then do we attribute this unprecedented gathering of future musical superstars in the hills above Los Angeles? What was it that inspired them all to head out west? Perhaps Neil Young said it best when he told an interviewer that he couldn't really say why he headed out to L.A. circa 1966. He and others were just going like lemmings. And that is the end of chapter 1. And we're at the 2-hour mark, and we're going to leave it there. Let's see, first of all, if we have questions, if folks would like for me to open up the lines, we can do that. We're going to keep this show as slim and trim as possible. I want to thank you to the super chatter. I want to give you a super thank you. Or the super chatters. So I'm going to just assume that we don't have a lot of questions that are going to be asked. So I want to shut it down right here, and then we're going to come right back. We're going to play some praise and worship music and get into prayer. Yeah, nobody's even listening. No, they all came out there. They were all called out there because this was where the intelligence community had planned to kick off this counterculture movement that they themselves created and wanted. That's what it is. Okay. So let's do that. And thank you again for listening. And if you're going to come right back, do indeed come right back. I hope you can hear me. Come right back if you'd like to for prayer, praise. Don't come into the next live stream with questions. I'm giving you your chance now. Takirka say, we're listening, LOL. Y'all just having a great conversation. And I like when folks is having such a great conversation. So, but yeah, I really don't see questions. I think everybody's getting it. So we'll just save the questions for the next one, okay? So we'll do another reading of this. What is it? This is Saturday. Let's say we'll do another reading Monday. And let's go ahead. I had questions about the information. Do you have questions about the information? TMH, I'm going to have to call you TMH because I ain't calling no man delicious and I ain't calling no man the Most High. Do you have any question about tonight's material? If you have a prayer request, the information to send me that prayer request is in the description box, my email address. Bro, whatever you smoking on, put it out. Okay, thank you. Okay, that Grateful Dead logo is called Steal Your Face, said 7th Ward Creole. Really? The one with the head split open? Sister Lou Wallace says, thank you, Brother Theo, much appreciated. Okay. Okay, if you have a question, just type it in the chat. We don't have to open up the phone lines. I don't think nobody even want to do that. Would you guys, Cypher says, we are always listening. Oh, I'm sorry, Cypher. I'm sorry. Was I being a little bit, was I being a little panty-fied? I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. I didn't mean it. I'm glad that you were listening, and I really hope it wasn't buffering bad. I was just reading the book. Chocolate E, let's ride. Says, no, I do not. That's right. Is Craig Mcgowan his son? Okay, so if you got a question, you might as well just type it. Just type the question. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's Brother Matthew. Brother Matthew, I need your help on something. Hold on. So I'm gonna have to go back and read the. Okay. TMH says, it's crazy how this reading and your Rick James work coincides. Isn't it something? Because I thought that it said that Rick James was kicking it with some of these Laurel Canyon people. Mm-hmm. Oh, Craig is his brother, Sharky Rags. Thank you for letting that be known. Sandra Kippert says, I just got here. I heard Steal Your Face. Are y'all talking about the Grateful Dead? Brother Matthew, I think that you did email me. I'm sorry. I'm going back and forth. I think you did email me. But if you could just email me one more time so I'll be sure to have it at the top of the emails. And I don't have to go looking for it. Just email me one more time and I'll ask you what it is I need to ask you. I need to ask you something. I need you to help me write something. Sharky Rag says that Dave's brother believes that a coven killed Dave and targets his family now. And I believe the same thing. Where can we find this information, Sharky Rags? Thank you again, Sister Lou. And thank you to everybody who's been in here listening tonight, all of you good, cool people. Lion of Judah, Lamb of God, Mark Simmons, Sister Takirika, Monique B, Mario's Taco, Sweet Queen, Cypher. So, I wanted to read more of this, if you wanted me to. My goal is for us to read it all. Yeah, Brother Matthew, I just need it in my email because I'm not going to remember it and I'm not going to come back to this chat and scroll all through the chat just to find where you left it at right there. So please, if you could do that. brothermintheo@gmail.com. Brother Charles K. Liptek says read on. Okay, so we'll read some more next time around. Let's get to some prayer and whatnot next. And by the way, the next chapter is called Power to the People. Call this a counterculture. And I wholeheartedly believed that this dude was taken out of there. I consider him a martyr for the movement of truth, for the truth of movement, just like I do William Cooper. And I could just tell, although the interviews that I saw of him, he had not become a believer. You got into your last breath. And I believe that in them last moments, if Crowley's death or Anton LaVey's death is any indication, if that's not all cap, and they actually said the things that they said in their final moments, then I believe that that's your last chance to make it right, to make your quote-unquote peace with your maker, like they say. And so I pray that he did. I pray that he did get a chance to do that. Brian Tisdale said, "What up? What up, though?" Sister Lou says, "Yes, I would love it. So much information condensed in that book." Yes, David Mcgowan is kicking behind. Chapter 2 is called "Power to the People." Call this a counterculture? That's what it's called. Okay, let's read a little bit of it. Okay, I'm going to give y'all a second chance because I love you. I love you. So I'm going to give y'all a second chance. I'm going to read some more. A second chance. You didn't do nothing wrong in the first place. That was my crazy, but I was like, okay, what, can they hear me? Are they listening? What's going on? Okay, so yes, I'm going to read the whole book. Tonight, we're going to read one more chapter. Okay, one more chapter. And my email is brothermintheo@gmail.com. Okay, now what did TMH say? TMH say, Crosby, Stills, and Nash hired away Rick James' bass player. Rick hooked him up. Rick also said he almost got caught up in the Sharon Tate massacre. That's right, TMH. That's absolutely right. I had forgotten about that. That's right. Rick James almost got caught up over there. It's a few people that I've heard over the years that say they almost got caught up over there. Did y'all know that the old 1970s, your daddy's era, porn star named John Holmes, he was maybe the first superstar porn star. But anyway, I was listening to some podcast, I think it might have been Joe Rogan, and they were talking about how he had got mixed up. He got mixed up in that too. So yes, it was just a strange thing the way that whole thing went down. I wonder. I mean, was Sebring and all of them, were they having some kind of big witch party over it? The Polanskis, and you can't tell me that Polanski didn't set that up. You just can't tell me he didn't. And I'm not the only person to think that also. The song Hotel California is about the place where you sell your soul at, where they do these rituals at. It's an actual manor or it's an actual place or building where they say that that's what the Hotel California is based off of. But it's one of those mansion parties that Cat Williams talked about, basically. So you take the lyrics to Hotel California, lyric by lyric, line by line, go line by line, and they're describing what it's like to be there for the first time. That's some new jacks. But yes, Mcgowan's works, like I said, I got 2 books from him. I like the way he writes. He knows his stuff. He's a good writer, but he's also conversational. Did y'all notice how conversational that was? Some of the times that I know you thought I was ad-libbing, I was reading it just like he wrote it. So, okay, let's read this chapter 2 right quick, and then I'm going to open up for some questions to get your questions together. Jot them down while I'm reading. I'm about to read with speed. Y'all ready? The TMH say Rick also was a supposedly, hold on. He said Rick also was a supposedly practicing Satanist. You see the hand gestures he be doing? Yes, indeed. Well, we caught him in a couple of Songwriter Secret for shores. You and I, talking about you and Satan, Could it be You and I? Would the lyrics to You and I tell it? And let me tell it, Mary Jane ain't just about Mary Weenie. Love Move says, Unplug, I'm so glad to see you, my brother. You are the original OG YouTuber. I grew up so much from your channel. I never heard the word rain the same. Everything you said came true 100%. Well, all praise is due to the living and true. And shout out to those who were there when I got here. Those who was already doing it. Yashkara, Black Child. Yashkara and I corresponded. He encouraged me greatly. He was watching his videos is what made me say, you know what? I wonder could I do that? I mean, I make beats. I know people that make beats. How do you put all that on video like that? I didn't know nothing about the smartphone. Applications, programs. It seemed like witchcraft to me. Magic. I have no idea how you're putting all of this together. But man, I wonder could I do that? You know, I'd be kicking it to the brothers and sisters in the porch and in the basement and out on the street corner. I was like, you know what? I bet you I could do this too. And so, by the will of the Creator, he made a space for me to do this too. But yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead. That's right. To the sixth. Right, that's right. We fit together like a hand in glove. No, the coldest part of You and I is some people say that I'm infatuated with you, but I don't care because they really don't know about the things that I say and do for you. And as far as I'm concerned, they all can go to hell. The way they hold that note on that hell, that's creepy. But okay, power to the people. Call this a counterculture. Ready? Uh-oh. Teddy, are you ready? I'm ready. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. Power to the people. Chapter 2. Power to the people. Call this a counterculture. And the quote is, everyone there had at one time or another been into Satanism, or like myself, had dabbled around the edges for sexual kicks. Quote from Sammy Davis Jr., referring to the victims at 10050 CeeLo Drive. He said, everyone there had at one time or another been into Satanism, or like myself, had dabbled around the edges for sexual kicks. Hey, baby. Hey, babe. Satanic chicks, they're groovy. In the previous chapter, we met a sampling of some of the most successful and influential rock music superstars who emerged from Laurel Canyon during its glory days. But these were, alas, more than just musicians and singers and songwriters who had come together in the canyon. They were destined to become the spokesmen and de facto leaders of a generation of disaffected youth, as Carl Gottlieb noted in David Crosby's co-written autobiography, The Unprecedented Mass Appeal of the New Rock and Roll gave the singers a voice in public affairs. That, of course, makes it all the more curious that these icons were, to an overwhelming degree, the sons and daughters of the military intelligence complex and the scions of families that have wielded vast wealth and power in this country for a very long time. It could, of course, be argued that there was nothing necessarily nefarious in the fact that so many of these icons of a past generation hailed from military intelligence families. Perhaps it could be suggested they had embarked on their chosen careers as a form of rebellion against the values of their parents. Great backstory. Great cover story. Make sure you write that one down, Josh. And that, I suppose, might be true in a couple of cases. But what are we to conclude from the fact that such an astonishing number of these folks, along with their girlfriends, wives, managers, mammies, and pappies, hail from a similar background? Are we to believe that the only kids from that era who had musical talent were the sons and daughters of Navy admirals, chemical warfare engineers, and Air Force intelligence officers? Or are they just the only ones who were signed to lucrative contracts and relentlessly promoted by their labels and the media? If these artists were rebelling against rather than subtly promoting the values of their parents, then why didn't they ever speak out against the people they were allegedly rebelling against? Why did Jim Morrison never denounce or even mention his father's key role in escalating one of America's bloodiest illegal wars? And why did Frank Zappa never pen a song exploring the horrors of chemical warfare, though he did pen a charming little ditty entitled Ritual Dance of the Child Killer? What? And you want to take rappers' lyrics to court? Okay. They shouldn't say the goofy stuff that they say, dry and wet snitching. Like they ain't got no sense. This is the first time in the history of America with as many illustrious criminals as it's had in its history that the criminals get off on telling that they're criminals. Have mercy. So yeah, they should take your little butt with your lyrics and fry you with them, because you ought to know better than saying them. But again, it's interesting that with all of the suspect and satanic and Luciferian lyrics that we've looked at, it's interesting that it's the one with the most blatant lyrics that they putting on blast, but they keeping their songwriter secret, ain't they? Okay, let's move on. A charming little ditty entitled Ritual Dance of the Killer. And which mamas and the papas song was it that laid waste to the values and actions of John Phillips' parents and in-laws? In other words, if you were really so against this establishment stuff and your family, your parents are part of this same establishment, how come that never slipped out? Not in song? And in which interview exactly did David Crosby and Stephen Stills disown the family values that they was raised with? We will be taking a much closer look at these performers as well as many of their contemporaries as we endeavor to determine how and why the youth counterculture of the 1960s was given birth. According to virtually all the accounts that I have read, this was essentially a spontaneous, organic response to the war in Southeast Asia and to the prevailing social conditions of the time. Conspiracy theorists, of course, have frequently opined that what began as a legitimate movement was at some point co-opted and undermined by intelligence operations such as COINTELPRO. Entire books, for example, have been written examining how presumably virtuous musical artists were subjected to FBI harassment and or whacked by the CIA, Bob Marley and many others, who, although we may not agree with of course we do not agree with the use of pharmakia or with womanizing or anything like that, you do have to say that it was some harmless stuff relative to what else was out there, and even sprinklings of some positive messages. And again, I understand the deception of believing that God is man is where everything goes left. Everything goes down the toilet. Once you add in that part messes up everything. Everything that could normally be pure and righteous and that you could work with just goes to mess. Pardon me, once you add that part in. But yes, this is what he's saying. He's saying, so there's a lot of research that talks about how these people that we just look at as, oh man, they just made this song, it's just a star, who cares, thinking about stars. They understand the influence of entertainers and how they shape the minds and hearts of the people. Anybody that shapes the minds and hearts of the people, if you as a YouTuber begin to shape the minds and hearts of the people to a certain degree, a certain level, at a certain speed, they gonna come see you. It's what they do. I don't care what you do. If you're a carpenter and you are doing that, they're gonna come see you. Don't matter what your job is in life. Shut up. Stop talking. The Ice-T album, Freedom of Speech. Just watch what you say. Here we will, as you may have already ascertained, take a decidedly different approach. The question that we will be tackling is a more deeply troubling one. What if the musicians themselves and various other leaders and founders of the movement, quote unquote, were every bit as much a part of the intelligence community as the people who were supposedly harassing them? What if, in other words, the entire youth culture of the 1960s was created not as a grassroots challenge to the status quo, but as a cynical exercise in discrediting and marginalizing the budding anti-war movement and creating a fake opposition that could be easily controlled and led astray? And what if the harassment these folks were subjected to was largely a stage-managed show designed to give the leaders of the counterculture some much-needed street cred? Well, I say, what if they not doing? What if they might be doing that right now with Gunna and Young Thug? Let's move on. This is also the theory that I presented in my Tricknology video about the occult origins of hip-hop, which invariably triggers some goofy goober who just thinks it's a ludicrous idea that they would create something to control, but they want you to think you created it just so they can drive you and it down into the depths of hell. Degrade your life, your living conditions, your quality of life. But yet you keep rolling with it and riding it because you're like, well, it's ours. This is my culture. It speaks to my generation. It speaks to my community. It speaks to my people. It's the reason why some old, farted out, musty hippies is still walking around places like Portland and Seattle playing this music here that we're reading about right now. Lost in the sauce, trapped in that time period, out of touch. Because that's the goal. The goal is always to kill, steal, and destroy. And to degrade the mind is a form of killing, stealing, and destroying. So let's move forward. They don't want smart slaves. And they don't want brave slaves. So, and what if the harassment these folks were subjected to was largely a state-managed show designed to give the leaders of the counterculture movement some much-needed street cred? You need for the people in the street to think that they really fighting for you. People in the street really thought Tupac was fighting for them. I'm serious. I ain't joking. What if in reality they were pretty much all playing on the same team? Look at the results of all the positive stuff he said. Nobody's affected by that. Everybody's affected by the negative things that he said and did. Everybody. Because you have to live in a world now where people have embraced thug. Wouldn't be a young thug if it wasn't a Tupac before him. To embrace a word that was once seen as degradation. You don't degrade me by calling me no thug. As bad as calling me nigga or something. But see how we embrace these things? That's what happens when you don't control what you call your culture. Same thing we're reading about right here. Let's read on. I should probably mention here that contrary to popular opinion, the hippie flower child movement was not synonymous with the anti-war movement. I thought they were. Explain this to me, Brother David. He says, as time passed, there was, to be sure, a fair amount of overlap between the two movements, and the mass media outlets, as is their wont to do, they did their very best to portray the flower power generation as the torchbearers of the anti-war movement. So the media kind of lumped them together for some purpose. Let's see what the purpose was. After all, a ragtag band of unwashed, drug-fueled long hairs sporting flowers and peace symbols was far easier to marginalize and villainize than, say, a bunch of respected college professors and their concerned students, which is what happened at first. The reality, however, is that the anti-war movement was already well underway before the first aspiring hippie arrived in Laurel Canyon. The first Vietnam War teach-in was held on the campus of the University of Michigan in March of 1965. Go Michigan. The first organized walk on Washington occurred just a few weeks later. Needless to say, there were no hippies in attendance at either event. Well, that problem would soon be rectified, and the anti-war crowd, those who were serious about ending the bloodshed in Vietnam anyway, they would be none too appreciative. As Barry Miles has written in his coffee table book, Hippie, there were some hippies involved in anti-war protests, particularly after the police riot in Chicago, 1968, when so many people got injured. But on the whole, for the most part, the movement activists, people that was in the movement, people that were ready and willing to shoot or blow something up, or people who would just be ready to do sit-ins and teach-ins, folks who were really active, boots on the ground people, they looked on hippies with disdain. Peter Coyote, narrating the documentary Hippies on the History Channel, added that some on the left even theorized that the hippies were the end result of a plot by the CIA to neutralize the anti-war movement with LSD, turning potential protesters into self-absorbed navel-gazers. An exasperated Abby Hoffman once described the scene as he remembered it thusly. There were all these activists, Berkeley recalls. There were all these activists, Berkeley radicals, White Panthers, all trying to stop the war and change things for the better. When we got flooded with all these flower children who only wanted drugs and sex, where the hell did the hippies come from? I'm just really tripping right now. Because I'm seeing how they use the native tongues as the hippie aspect and brought that in the midst of like real revolutionary type of talk and talk of real change. The Jungle Brothers, Queen Latifah, Moni Love, Tribe Called Quest, Black Sheep, they all kind of came in with like playfulness. It was playful. Party. Sex. Party. Sprinkle in some blackness. De La Soul even. I know this, so I point at Q-Tip and he says black is black. They sprinkled in little things to make you think, oh yeah, the native tongue, yeah, they really Afrocentric. They dressed more of the part. And so did the hippies. The hippies dressed more of the part than the real movement people did. like what they say, professors and students sitting there in their regular clothes protesting, didn't get the bang for the media buck that these crazy looking drug and sex crazed hippies were getting. They drew all the attention. So the attention went away from those who was really about change to those who looked the part and was into the trend. And would be easy to bend. What? And goofy. So, okay, let's read. Very interesting here. I remember making that connection before. I don't. Anyway. Pardon me. So needless to say, there were no hippies in attendance at either event. Well, that problem would soon be rectified, and the anti-war crowd, those who were serious about ending the bloodshed in Vietnam anyway, would be none too appreciative. Oh, I'm sorry. I read that already. Okay. All right, here we go. Okay, here we go. An exasperated Abbie Hoffman once described the scene as he remembered it thusly. There were all these activists, Berkeley radicals, White Panthers, all people trying to stop the war and change things for the better. Then all of a sudden we get flooded with all these flower children who were into drugs and sex. Where the hell did the hippies come from, quote unquote? As it turns out, they came initially at least from a rather private, isolated, largely self-contained neighborhood in Los Angeles known as Laurel Canyon. In contrast to the other canyons slicing through the Hollywood Hills, Laurel Canyon has its own market, the semi-famous Laurel Canyon Country Store. It has its own deli and cleaners. It has its own elementary school, the Wonderland School, Alice in... He never gave nothing to the Tin Man that he didn't already have. References to Alice in Wonderland and references to The Wizard of Oz, both oftentimes can be used to indicate MK Ultra involvement. During its heyday, the Canyon even had its own management company, Lookout Management, to handle the talent. That's right, if they was handling your talent, you better look out. At one time, it even had its own newspaper. One other thing that I should add here is that this has not been an easy line of research for me to conduct, primarily because I have been, for as long as I can remember, a huge fan of 1960s music and culture. Though I didn't come of age, so to speak, until the 1970s, I've always felt as though I was cheated by being denied the opportunity to experience firsthand the era that I was so obviously meant to inhabit. During my high school and college years, while my peers were mostly into faceless corporate rock, think Journey, Foreigner, Kansas, Boston, and perhaps worse yet, the twin horrors of new wave and disco music. Yeah. I was faithfully spinning my Hendrix, Joplin, and Doors albums, which I still have, in the original vinyl versions, while my color organ, remember those? Yep, I remember those, competed with my black light and strobe light. I grew my hair long until well past the age when it should have been sheared off. I may have even strung beads across the doorway to my room. But it is possible that I'm confusing my life with that of Greg Brady, who, as we all remember, once converted his dad's home office into a groovy bachelor pad. Anyway, one of the most difficult aspects of this journey that I've been on for the last 15 years or so has been watching so many of my former idols and mentors fall by the wayside, as it became increasingly clear to me that people who I once thought were the good guys were in reality something entirely different. Yeah, that's what blows your mind. That part. The first to fail, naturally enough, were the establishment figures, the first to fall, naturally enough, were the establishment figures, the politicians who I once quite foolishly looked up to as people who were fighting the good fight within the confines of the system to bring about real change. Though it now pains me to admit this, there was a time when I admired the likes of Egads, George McGovern and Jimmy Carter, as well as California Poles, Tom Hayden and Jerry Brown. I even had high hopes, oh so many years ago, for, am I really admitting this in print, Bill Clinton. Since I mentioned Jerry Governor Moonbeam Brown, by the way, I must now digress just a bit. As luck would have it, Jerry Brown was curiously enough a longtime resident of a little place called Laurel Canyon. As readers of my previous work, Programmed to Kill, that's what it's called, may recall, Brown lived on Wonderland Avenue, not too many doors down from 8763 Wonderland Avenue. The site of the infamous 4 on the Floor murders, regarded by grizzled LA homicide detectives as the most bloody and brutal multiple murder in the city's very bloody history. As it turns out, the most bloody mass murder in LA's history took place in one of the city's most serene, pastoral, and exclusive neighborhoods. And strangely enough, the case usually cited as the runner-up for the title of bloodiest crime scene, the murders of Stephen Parent, Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Wojtek Frykowski, and Abigail Folger at 10050 CeeLo Drive in Benedict Canyon, just a couple miles to the west of Laurel Canyon, had deep ties to the Laurel Canyon scene as well. So it was just a couple miles to the west where the Tate LaBianca murders were. So let me correct that. As previously mentioned, so yes, the Tate LaBianca murders were a couple of miles outside of Laurel Canyon in Benedict Canyon, for the record. As previously mentioned, victims Folger and Frykowski lived in Laurel Canyon at 2774 Woodstock Road in a rented home right across the road from a favorite gathering spot for Laurel Canyon royalty. Many of the regular visitors to Cass Elliott's home, including a number of shady drug dealers, were also regular visitors to the Folger Frykowski home. Frykowski's son, by the way, yes, Mcgowan know what he doing. So yes, please plug me in with the information about how to find his brother or whatnot. Please do. Check out this catch. He says Frykowski's son, by the way, was stabbed to death on June 6, 1999. Stabbed to death on June 6, 1999. That's 66666. 30 years after his father met the same fate. Victim Jay Sebring's acclaimed hair salon sat right at the mouth of Laurel Canyon, just below the Sunset Strip, and it was Sebring, alas, who was credited with sculpting Jim Morrison's famous mane. So Sebring was Morrison's barber. One of the investors in his Sebring International business venture was none other than Mr. Papa John Phillips. Sharon Tate was also well known in Laurel Canyon, where she was a frequent visitor to the homes of friends like John Phillips, Cass Elliott, and Abigail Folger, yes, that Folger, of the Folger family coffee empire. And when she wasn't in Laurel Canyon, many of the canyon regulars, both famous and infamous, made themselves at home at her place on CeeLo Drive. Canyonite Van Dyke Parks, for example, dropped by for a visit on the very day of the murders. And Denny Doherty, the other papa in the Mamas and the Papas, has claimed that he and John Phillips were invited to the CeeLo Drive home on the night of the murders. So they was almost there too. But as luck would have it, they never made it over. There's something to that. Rick James, them, maybe the entire satanic community knew about it, and they might have been invited to watch. No, that's far-fetched. Not that the community knew about it, but that they would all be invited. But I do believe that the entire satanic community in that area knew what was about to happen to Sharon Tate because of the Rosemary's Baby connection. Okay, and Denny Doherty. Okay. Similarly, hold on, here's more. Similarly, Chuck Negron of Three Dog Night, a regular visitor to the Wonderland Death House, had set up a drug buy on the night of that mass murder, but he fell asleep and never made it over. This house was all the way live. This is what my grandma used to call a flop house. Along with the victims, the alleged killers also lived in and were very much a part of the Laurel Canyon scene. Bobby Cupid Beausoleil, for example, his beautiful son, lived in a Laurel Canyon apartment during the early months of 1969. Charles Tex Watson, who allegedly led the death squad responsible for the carnage at CeeLo Drive, lived for a time in a home on, guess where? Wonderland Avenue. During that time, curiously enough, Watson co-owned and worked in a wig shop in Beverly Hills called Crown Wig Creations Limited that was located near the mouth of Benedict Canyon. Meanwhile, one of J. Sebring's primary claims to fame was his expertise in crafting men's hairpieces. Really? Which he did in his shop near the mouth of Laurel Canyon. A typical day then in the late 1960s would find Watson crafting hairpieces for an upscale Hollywood clientele near Benedict Canyon, where the Tate LaBianca murders happened, and then returning home to Laurel Canyon, while Sebring crafted hairpieces for an upscale Hollywood clientele. Near Laurel Canyon, and then returned home to Benedict Canyon. Sorry about that. Eyes getting tired. And then one crazy day, as we all know, one of them became a killer and the other his victim. But there's nothing odd about that, I suppose. So let's move on. Oh, wait a minute. We can't quite move on just yet, as I forgot to mention that Sebring's Benedict Canyon home at 9820 Easton Drive was a rather infamous Hollywood death house that had once belonged to Jean Harlow and Paul Byrne. The mismatched pair were wed on July 2nd, 1932, when Harlow, already a huge star of the silver screen, was just 21 years old. Just 2 months later, on September 5th, Byrne caught a bullet to the head in his wife's bedroom. He was found sprawled naked in a pool of his own blood, his corpse drenched with his wife's perfume. Upon discovering the body, Byrne's butler promptly contacted MGM's head of security, Whitey Hendry, who in turn contacted Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg. All three of the men descended upon the Benedict Canyon home to, tidy up a bit. A couple hours later, they decided to contact the LAPD. This scene would be repeated years later when Sebring's friends would rush to the very same house to clean up before investigators of the Tate murders arrived. Burns' death was, as is so often the case, written off as a suicide. His newlywed wife, strangely enough, was never called as a witness at the inquest. Burns' other wife, which is to say his common-law wife, Dorothy Millette, reportedly boarded a Sacramento riverboat on September 6, 1932, the day after Paul's death. She was next seen floating belly up in the Sacramento River. Her death, as would be expected, was also ruled a suicide. What is that noise? Less than 5 years later, Harlow herself dropped dead at the ripe old age of 26. Yes, because there are witches in the mix. A curse causeless shall not come. But when you become a part of the group, like we saw in Rosemary's Baby, if the group decides that somehow you don't fit now, or you've fallen out of favor with said group, as a part of that group, they can curse you or hex you. Okay. At the time, authorities opted not to divulge the cause of death, though it was later claimed that bad kidneys had done her in. During her brief stay on this planet, Harlow had cycled through 3 turbulent marriages at 25. Wow. I mean, at 26 years old, she'd been married 3 times. And yet still found time to serve as godmother to Bugsy Siegel's daughter, Millicent. Though burnt in Bugsy Siegel, the gangster, who helped to establish Las Vegas. Pardon me. Or who helped it to become what it is today. Now, though Burns was the most famous body to be hauled out of the Eastern Drive house in a coroner's bag, it certainly wasn't the only one. Another man had reportedly committed suicide there as well in some unspecified fashion. Yet another unfortunate soul drowned in the home's pool, and a maid was once found swinging from the end of a rope. Her death, needless to say, was ruled a suicide as well. That's a lot of blood for one home to absorb. But the house's morbid history, though a turnoff to many prospective residents, was reportedly exactly what attracted J.C. Bring to the property. That was something that he thought made the property quaint and unique. His murder would further darken the black cloud hanging over the home. As Laurel Canyon chronicler Michael Walker has noted, LA's 2 most notorious mass murders, one in August of 1969 and the other in July of 1981, both involving 5 victims, though at Wonderland, one of the 5 miraculously survived. And yes, it was the Wonderland murders that the first big adult film star John Holmes was involved in. Okay, so let me correct that for the record. John Holmes was involved in or cited with the Wonderland murders. Okay, all right, let's move on. Okay, so it says, as Laurel Canyon chronicler Michael Walker has noted, LA's 2 most notorious mass murders, one in August of 69 and the other in July of 81, provided rather morbid bookends for Laurel Canyon's glory years. Walker, though like others who have chronicled that time and place, treats these brutal crimes as though they were unfortunate aberrations. The reality, however, is that 9 bodies recovered from CeeLo Drive and Wonderland Avenue constitute just the tip of a very large and a very bloody iceberg. To partially illustrate that point, Diane Linkletter, daughter of famed entertainer Art Linkletter, legendary comedian Lenny Bruce, screen idol Sal Mineo, starlet Inger Stevens, and silent film star Ramon Navarro all have something in common. They were all found dead in their homes, either in or at the mouth of Laurel Canyon, in the decade between 1966 and 1976. Wow. And all five were in all likelihood murdered in those Laurel Canyon homes. Only two of them are officially listed as murder victims. Mineo, who was stabbed to death outside his home at 8563 Holloway Drive on February 12th, 1976, and Navarro, who was killed near the county store in a decidedly ritualistic fashion on the eve of Halloween, 1968. Inger Stevens' death in her home at 8000 Woodrow Wilson Drive on April 30th, 1970, which is Walpurgisnacht on the occult calendar, German witchcraft, was officially a suicide, though why she opted to propel herself through a decorative glass screen as part of that suicide remains a mystery. Sounds like old Donny Hathaway. They claimed he jumped, and most folks believe he was pushed. Perhaps she just wanted to leave behind a gruesome crime scene, and simple overdoses can be so, bloodless and boring. Wow. Diane Linkletter, according to legend, sailed out the window of her Shoreham Towers apartment because, in her LSD-addled state, she thought she could fly. Didn't they say the same thing about the man who used to play Superman before Christopher Reeve? His name escapes me. It's on the tip of my tongue. When Superman was on black and white television before I was born, before my daddy was born, I want to say. Them look like the 40s or something. Well, I don't know, maybe it was the 40s. But yes, okay. Anyway, let's move on. Okay. Diane Linkletter, according to legend, sailed out the window of her Shoreham Towers apartment because in her LSD-addled state she thought she could fly. We know this because Art himself told us that it was so. Oh, Art Linkletter. Did he really? And because the story was retold throughout the 1970s as a cautionary tale about the dangers of drugs. What we weren't told, however, is that Diane Linkletter, born curiously enough on Halloween Day 1948, was not alone when she plunged 6 stories to her death on the morning of October 4th, 1969. Au contraire. She was with a gent by the name of Edward Durston, who in a completely unexpected turn of events, just so happened to accompany actress Carol Wayne to Mexico some 15 years later. Carol Wayne, alas, perhaps weighed down by her enormous breast, of course he's being facetious here, managed to drown in barely a foot of water, while Mr. Durston promptly disappeared. So this was not the first time he is with a star who happens to end up deaded. That's the point. And deaded in very strange circumstances, while he happens to disappear and get out of there. So as would be expected, he was never questioned by authorities about Carol Wayne's curious death. After all, it is quite common for the same guy to be the sole witness to 2 separate accidental deaths. Oh yeah, the police, they always overlook that when that happens, right? Art Linkletter also neglected to mention that just weeks before Diane's curious death, another member of the Linkletter clan, Art's son-in-law, John Zweier, caught a bullet to the head in the backyard of his Hollywood Hills homes. But that, of course, was an unconnected suicide. That was the official word. I'm not even going to discuss here the circumstances of Lenny Bruce's death from acute morphine poisoning on August 3rd, 1966. Because to be perfectly honest, I don't know too many people who don't already assume that Lenny was whacked. I'll just note here that his funeral was well attended by the Laurel Canyon rock icons, and control over his unreleased material fell into the hands of a guy by the name of Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa gets the masters. And another unsavory character named Phil Spector. You remember when Phil Spector shot the woman, and that was a big Hollywood trial that was on TV. Seemed like it was as big a trial. I don't want to say as big as the OJ trial, but it was big everyday news, everyday entertainment news, every day. Phil Spector, who, as far as producers go, and if you remember, what did John Todd say that David Crosby told him about the producers? Phil Spector was a producer. And Phil Spector is known for an innovation in production. I hate to even call it an innovation in production, but he's credited for it. But I'm not going to say he's the first one to really do it, but to create the wall of sound. Not just where you hear the guitar, oh yeah, that's a guitar. And that's a bass, and that's the drums. There's the music. No. He came up with the wall of sound where you couldn't necessarily just track by track, pardon me, unless you had a very trained ear. You wouldn't be able to pull out those instruments like that. This blended together wall of sound created an ambiance. And that's a popular thing that producers do to this day. Okay, but anyway. It says, okay. Oh my God. Okay. I'm not even going to discuss here the circumstances of comedian Lenny Bruce's death from acute morphine poisoning on August 3rd, 1966, because to be perfectly honest, I don't know too many people who don't already assume that Lenny was whack. Lenny Bruce was really off the chain and considered to be an anti-establishment entertainer. For real, for real. People believed that. And people believed it so much that they thought it wasn't an act. And the powers that be also believed that he really was uncontrollable and anti and would not conform. But yet, he was blowing up. Those two things can never go together in this Luciferian controlled world. Can't have both at the same time. So, Dave says, I'll just note here that this funeral was well attended by the Laurel Canyon rock icons, and control over his unreleased material fell into the hands of a guy by the name of Frank Zappa and another unsavory character named Phil Spector, whose crack team of studio musicians, pardon me, dubbed the Wrecking Crew, were the actual musicians playing on many studio recordings by such Laurel Canyon bands as the Monkees, the Byrds, the Beach Boys, and the Mamas and the Papas. So in other words, a lot of them could not really play, and so they had this stand-in band. Phil Spector's guys would actually play the instruments and then slap the Monkees' names on it, or the Byrds, or the Beach Boys, or the Mamas and the Papas. And that is the end of chapter 3. The end of chapter 2. Chapter 3, we will we'll shoot for we'll shoot for Monday. We'll shoot for Monday for chapter 3. See what type of comments we get and whatnot. I have over 800 videos. If you just want to hear a sermon or a reading of scripture, I have a lot of those. quite a few to choose from. But again, this is part of closing the lesson of the songwriter's secret, which brings some people who wouldn't even be interested in hearing a sermon or a scripture reading. This helps to bring them in. And that's what we want to do. At the end of the day, we want to win souls. So thank you. I'm going to drink some cool water here, and maybe let this Navage cycle through my nostrils one more good time. And then we're going to do some prayer after we play some praise and worship music, okay? So that's coming up next on the next live stream. So that means you're going to have to come out of this one. So goodbye. Bye, American Pie. I'm in my hippie mode now. So, yep. So, goodbye to everybody who's here. We got 370 people in the house. It's in the title, Lord Jesus. Thank you to the super chatters. Thank you to the moderators. Thank you to everyone who's listening tonight. And I appreciate you. Come back if you want to. All right? Come back if you want to. I got to go. Okay. Come back. I'll be back. It may take me 2 minutes, 3 minutes to set up the next live stream. Okay? So come back if you're interested in that. Peace and love to you all. Thank you. And we'll pick up where we left off, chapter 3, in the next read. Right now, let's get to heavyweight jamming, knocking out mammon with some good praise and worship and prayer before my entire voice just gets out of here. All right. In a minute. Thank you, Brother Dwight Ian, for being in the place to be. Chris G, Joshua Yetu, Respect Your Elders. I'm a big fan of Cat, says meow. Gog Magog Draven, Marcus Moore, Tristan Green. I bring it every day. Thank you all. All right. Gotta go. You ain't got to go home, but you got to get up out of here.